Okay, so my name is Sean Posey. I am presenting my paper with Nick Magnan, Do Spouses Share Information? Exploring Intra-Household Information Sharing and Learning Using a Lab in the Field. No, I think it broke now. No, it's broken. Oh, there we go. All right. Sorry about that. For some reason it's messing up. All right, so kind of a quick summary of what this paper is on. So like the title kind of mentioned, I use a lab in the field to kind of test for information sharing between spouses in northern Ghana. I use an incentivized game, and then I randomly assign which spouse in the household will be trained on this game. And then we kind of have two payment systems. One is joint and one is individual. And the joint is where we kind of take the whole household's performance and cash, and we split it evenly between the two of them. And the other is individual, so they receive the cash that they won from the game itself. And just kind of provide the quick results in case you have to leave early, you can see what the ending of this is. We do find that income control matters when being trained by the research team. However, that kind of drops out whenever it goes to information sharing. And we do find evidence that women share information more to their husbands than husbands share to their wives. All right, so the main research questions is, do husbands and wives share information with each other? And then more specifically, how well do they share information with each other? Because it's one thing to just kind of tell you like, oh yeah, I got trained yesterday on how to do pit planting. You just kind of put your finger in the ground and then drop the seed in there. Not much information was actually transferred to you. You might be like, okay, then you just go out and start just popping holes into the ground and planting. It doesn't teach you that you need to do it row planting and how far apart they need to be. So we also want to look at like the performance change in information as well. And the second, the kind of other part of it is, how does income control impact information sharing? And this kind of comes from our observation in Ghana of this kind of two kind of household production managing schemes. One is separate economies, where the husband has their plots and they produce on their plots and get the outcomes from their plots, and their money, they keep it, and the wife does the exact same. And the other is this kind of joint, where the husband and wife jointly manage this plot and the household kind of controls the outputs and receives the benefits. And we want to kind of see if we could mimic this in a lab setting and look at whether or not that also has an impact on information sharing. And then finally, the kind of big question that I want to kind of look at with this is, how do we kind of once we understand how information sharing occurs in the household, how do we kind of design future information dissemination strategies to kind of be as inclusive as possible to both men and women? Right, and kind of like the motivation, why would we care about information sharing? The big part is that information is the first part of a technology adoption. So if you do not learn about this technology, you can't really adopt it. You're not aware of it, and you just kind of just don't have access to it and don't know about it. And then the second part is that women are excluded from these information sources, primarily from extensions, where they are mostly male-dominant extension agents. And when Condelis et al. Found that when more women were extension agents, women's learning and increased, specifically on pit planting. And next is that women are kind of excluded from male-dominant social networks. So Beeman and Dillon found that when you kind of use these nodes, these central nodes in a social network to kind of increase the total number of people that will receive information, women were kind of excluded from that. And that was often caused by women having mostly other women in their social network, and that their connection to other men was primarily through their husbands. So if their husband is not sharing information with them, that's another cutoff point that they don't get information. All right, and then what do we kind of know about within household information sharing? There's very few studies that kind of directly observe it. One major one is Fletcher and Mesbah that found women had much lower knowledge about the access to credit than their husbands. And then the second paper is the Nyquist and Jayachandran, which is kind of the main paper that kind of got me to think about this more. Looked at childcare, and when husbands went to get childcare classes, the wives kind of pulled that information out of them. But when women went, the husbands didn't really care, and they weren't getting that information from the husband or from their wives. And then the other part is in how does information transfer to between husbands and wives? And Benishe et al. Finds that men heavily discount information that they receive from women. And even more closely is that Conlin et al. Found that husbands specifically treat their wives' information about uncertainty as equal to a stranger. Okay, so more specifically to our experiment, how do we plan to observe information sharing? We get one couple from each household, and we ask them to participate in our experiments. Each spouse will attend one of 2 meetings, and in that meeting, they'll be asked to perform a task, and then we will train one of them on how to optimally perform this task, and then they will go home, and then they'll be allowed to train their spouse, and then their spouse will come the next day and perform this without any training from us. All right, so the game is the Tower of Hanoi, and the objective is to get the discs from the first tower to the third tower, and you can't place a larger disc on a small disc, and you can't pick up more than 1 disc at a time. And we use the 4-disc version in our experiment. So why do an abstract game instead of like just asking them like specifically, do you guys share information, and asking about like the last time their husband went to an extension training? It's because we wanted to kind of create a controlled setting and kind of remove these like cultural relevances. The husband might not share information because he thinks, oh, this is men's job, like women don't need to do that. And we want to kind of remove all of this from the setting and kind of just focus primarily on, does this information sharing occur, sans all this other things. And then the other is that we don't want to rely on recall data. We don't want to ask them, oh, what did you learn from the previous extension? Oh, this, and then their wife said something else, and they both could be right, but they just both said different things and like left out other things. All right, so for our experiment, we had 4 treatment groups. The households were assigned to a husband first, and a wife first, or a wife first, and then one of the individual payments. So husband first means that the husband in that household goes to the first meeting and is trained, and then wife first means that the wife is trained. And then they were assigned to one of the 2 individual payments as well, or treatments as well. So either individual and joints, and those are what I explained earlier. Right. So for our sample, we are looking at 410 households across 14 communities in northern Ghana. And there's 2 participants per household for a total of 820 participants. And more so, we kind of had an age cutoff just so that 1, for COVID reasons, and 2, kind of reduce the burden of age on their performance. All right, so what was the experiment? So we had about 4 meetings per community. The meetings were done by payment treatment. So you'd go to the community on the first day, and we split the sample into 2. One was the individual and one was the joint. And the reason was we didn't want them kind of like fighting about and having kind of conflicts of like, why am I getting paid this way? And like this is ridiculous and stuff like that. So we thought this would be kind of a better way of doing it. And the other is that we had them perform it on an Android tablet, and the Android tablet recorded all the data for us, so we didn't have to kind of write it down and have kind of errors from that. Right, so the meetings kind of went pretty similarly for both meetings. We'd have the introduction, then we'd have them explain the rules, the objectives, and how to use a tablet. And then we give them 3 rounds to play the game. The first 2 are practice rounds where they just kind of play. It doesn't matter what their score is. There's no cash for them on that one. But in the first meeting, they're trained before they play for the final round. And we train them on how to how to get to the 15 moves, which is the minimum number of moves, and more so explain why you need to make those moves. So we kind of explain it a little bit farther than just having a memorization. And then the second meeting kind of goes exactly as the first meeting, except we have a training survey where we ask the spouse who comes on the second day, were you trained? How long were you trained? How were you trained? And very specifically, were you trained by other people than your spouse? So we can kind of see whether or not that occurred. And then they play directly through all the way to the third round without any training. All right. So from this, we have 6 hypotheses that we're going to be testing. The first one is whether or not this payment treatment has an impact on the first day. And specifically, we believe that the individual payment treatment will be more likely to perform better, and that's because you get to keep your own money. So you have more of an incentive to play better than if you are sharing that money with your spouse, or that your money that you get is conditional on your spouse's. And then following that logic, we expect that joint payment people will be performing better in the second day. And that would be that the spouse in the first day's money is tied to their spouse. So they share information and train so they can get benefits from that. And then 3 and 4 is the idea that men will just kind of do this better. And I know you're thinking like, oh, like, why would men do it better? Like, do you think men are better at this? Not at all. I think that men benefit more from their wife's income, because women are more likely to spend their money on household goods and better food for the household, while the typical story goes, men take their money and they go buy alcohol. So women get less benefit from men's money. And the 4, why would men train their wives more than women will train their husbands? Well, kind of as Conlin et al. Showed, men don't listen to their wives. So why would they spend their time trying to train someone who they think won't even listen to them at all? And then 5 and 6 is looking at how does the payment treatment affect across genders. So is the payment treatment, like the difference between the payment treatments, more impactful for men than it is for women? And we believe that for the first day, that this, like, men will definitely be more likely to strive for that individual payments because they can get all the money they can. And that will drive that result. So we expect that men will do better across payment treatment. The impact of payment treatment will be greater for men in the first day, but in the second day, we expect it to be a little less because they're not as likely to share that information, or they're more likely to share that information, so kind of drop it. All right, so out of all those hypotheses, I only put up 2 graphs for hypothesis 3 and 4, which I think are the ones that everyone's excited about, which one's better, men or women. And from these graphs, you think, this shows me not a lot. And when I looked at the graphs, I thought, oh no, I don't have results. This is gonna go really bad. But this is just sample means. It doesn't control for a lot of things. And you can kind of see there's some differences. So you look at the first one is men and women's differences in the first meeting, and men and women's in the second meeting. And you can kind of see that, like, there is differences here, but as you go to the rounding, that's equal out. All right, but however, when we do the controls, so this is the econometric model that we are going to use. The outcome variable is just the negative number of total moves. The other one that we are looking at using is the inverse, but when I did it, they came out to be identical. The point estimates were different, but the results were the same. And we have the controls will be age and education, 2 things that I expect to be highly correlated with performance. Household composition, if the household has a lot of kids, the wife might have less time to train their husband, so that could impact training. Community fixed effects is just kind of control for specific to that community. Effects that we might not be able to capture. And then we cluster the error term at the meeting level, which is when they're being trained and everything. All right, so for the results, we do find some. We find that first one quite large, that the individual payment treatments do perform better than the joint. And we do find that when you get to keep your own money, you're more likely to perform better, which every economist is like, of course. But we do find something that is interesting, and that is the no effect here is great. That means that men and women performed identical when they were trained. However, women performed worse in the second day, which means that the men didn't train their wives, and the women did train theirs. And that's for me, that's a great result. I'm very happy about that. But it also has very important results for the extension and training and how we kind of are doing things now and how we should switch it in the future. And then we do find the result that men had a larger payment treatment effect in the first day, but we don't find much in the second day. And then just kind of moving on because I'm running out of time, just kind of wrap up the results. So I kind of just said it that women performed similar to men in the first day, and men outperformed women in the second day, meaning that that information was transferred from women to their husbands, but less so for men to their wives. And that we did see this payment treatment had a large impact on the first day, but then it kind of dropped off in the second day. And what does this mean for our extension training? That we should probably prioritize women attendance in these trainings, because that will maximize the total amount of people that will be getting information within that household. And that household production management may impact individual willingness to attend and learn trainings. If you're a separate household, you might be more likely and more excited to adopt new technologies because it's benefiting you than so it is benefiting the household. Thanks. Do you guys any questions? Yes.
During the trainings, did you have men and women separate, or the trainings were together?
Men and women were together in the trainings. The only thing that was separate was the payments treatments. So in the picture that should be up there, it looks like there's just a bunch of women here. There's a man here, and there are other meetings, there's men and then all kind of together as well. This is just one picture that doesn't highlight that, but yeah, they were joined together. We didn't split them up by gender. So, yes.
Yeah, I just have some questions about motivation for research. Can you talk a little bit about mechanical factors or like economic reasoning theory behind the design? It's not very clear to me why the husband brought over the information the household, and why you know likely to share information, and why income plays a role in information sharing. I think I have some idea that maybe it's because of each household bargaining power, and I'm more likely to make decisions.
Yeah.
In the household, so they're more likely to share information, and women less likely to share information because they just follow their husband. Or there might be something about like transferable activity or non-transferable activity, which is probably related to your design for and individual and
yeah. So yeah, the theoretical framework in the paper is quite long, and I didn't want to kind of bore you guys with that. But I do kind of look at all those things. So some of the factors is like, as you can see here, like you have a lot of things going on, but this is like the knowledge learning, this is efforts, and we kind of capture we kind of look at all the different effects of like this would be looking at like the knowledge transfer between the spouses, and we kind of use the literature to kind of guide how we think this will be going. So we looked at like Common et al. and said that okay, information transfer from women to men is probably going to be much lower because men are going to listen. So we expect this to be a low number. We have this kind of fee parameter, which is the kind of benefit I receive from my spouse's income. So it's kind of like if you are putting something in the household good, then that benefits me. Or I just have altruism and I think that I want my wife to be happy, so therefore I give her money. Or if she has more money, that's better for me. And so we kind of looked at a lot of these. This is a more simplified model. The one in the paper is even more massive, where we actually look at the potential of post like payment treatment reshuffling of the money as well. And I had one student go out and call these households afterwards to kind of see, did this occur? And what we found is men kept their money, which wasn't a huge shock. But more so that I thought what was going to happen is that men were kind of going to demand the money from the wives. But what happened was either the women kept their money or they just immediately gave some of it to their husband. So there was reshuffling afterwards. And I don't have numbers on that. I need to have him kind of write up the data for that. But I was just kind of curious if we do see this reshuffling. But he said that it was like a small amount and the wife would come in and be like, here's a small amount for you, the rest is for me. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you very much. This is up here.
Yeah, I can do it.
Okay.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Tarana. I'm a PhD candidate in Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University. And I'm really excited to be just talking about this work, which is really in its preliminary stage right now, but also my research agenda in general, which is to try and unpack the effects of income improving instruments and how they affect the attitudes toward and experience of intimate partner violence by women. It's of interest as the prior literature in applied microeconomics has been conflicted on how improvements in income can affect women's experience of intimate partner violence. On one hand, we've seen that, especially in the case of cash transfer programs, an increased income generally has resulted in lower reporting of physical violence. This has also been seen in seminal work, which looks at the earnings of women relative to men across industries. But both literature, or I would say theoretical models in economics and psychology, do hypothesize as well that when women's income is likely to improve, it can also increase their risk and experience of intimate partner violence for two main reasons, one of which would be men or their male partners would want to exert violence to be able to extract resources from them. Or it could be a way to reassert their position and or their bargaining power within that relationship. And so what I'm particularly interested in is to study labor-intensive industries in low and middle income countries that are primarily export-oriented and have a strong preference for employing low-skilled workers, which is predominantly women. What I also find that in these countries and these industries, the enforcement of legislation protecting worker well-being is often limited and weak. And very specifically for today, I will be discussing the minimum wage policy in the garment sector in Bangladesh and talking about the effect of the policy change in the end of 2013 in the sector. A few important things I want to mention before we move ahead about the minimum wage policy in Bangladesh. So it's not a daily minimum wage rate that's applied. The government stipulates a monthly minimum earning for the workers, provided they work for 208 hours in the month. The regular hours in a week are 48, and as per the law, an individual can be employed for a maximum of 60 hours in a week. However, I think in the field, there is evidence of workers being employed for more than 60 hours in a week. So there is, I would say, evasion of the basic legislation around workers' well-being in the sector. And just to give you an idea of how the minimum pay is set, it's specified for different categories of workers, where grade 7 would be your very entry level for all different kinds of tasks within the industry. For moving up to grade 1, where grade 1 and 2 are more of supervisory roles and very high skilled workers. So a bulk of your workers are employed between grades 7 to 3. And as I mentioned already, I'm testing the effect of the minimum wage increase in the end of 2013 on women's both attitudes towards and incidents of violence. While the literature on minimum wages is huge, and there's also a lot of work done on the garment industry in Bangladesh, there are a few key lessons I wanted to highlight before we get into the discussion today. The first of which being a paper by Francine Blau and Larry Kahn, who study more than 20 countries in the late 20th century and find that a high wage floor is expected to most likely affect workers at the bottom of the wage distribution. And within this industry and many other industries, it's typically women who are at the bottom of the wage distribution. So this minimum wage policy in the garment sector is likely to disproportionately affect women for two reasons. One, that majority of the factory operators are women, and also that as they are at the bottom of the wage distribution within the industry. Second, more recent work has shown that women are being paid less than men in this industry, and that wage gap is also increasing in the more recent years. And lastly, a finding from a working paper that is, I think, by Rachel Heath and her co-authors, that's likely to be published soon, is where they sort of test how hourly wages are changing for garment workers. And they compare this with workers in other manufacturing industries between the garment dominated and other districts of Bangladesh. And what they find is that the hourly wages are improving. I will be doing a similar analysis, and my findings are very different, and I wanted like to talk about that in more detail. So I wanted to highlight this result for you guys. And to summarize what I think eventually the contribution and outcome of this work would be, it would help in firstly identifying the effect of an income shock that is disproportionately affecting women. And as I mentioned, a lot of the literature looking at how income affects IPV is concentrated on studying the effect of cash transfer programs. So in this sense, I'm hoping to study an instrument that is slightly more, is not kind of biased with other outcomes that might be affected through, for instance, in a cash transfer program, they're often bundled with other components that are likely to improve social outcomes and also maybe even IPV outcomes. In this case, the minimum wage policy will not be having an indirect effect on IPV except through income improvement. Second, I'm also hoping, so this paper and this work is contributing to the literature on looking at outcomes of workers in the manufacturing sector, which typically are concentrated more on skill-based training, gender gaps in management and pay, and also improvement of worker productivity. And lastly, this is also would be in addition to just the vast volume of literature on minimum wages. A lot of which is focused on low-skilled workers, but doesn't look so closely at outcomes of women. And the study of all the literature on sector-specific minimum wage policy has mostly been concentrated in the United States, and this is evidence from a low-income country. So for this analysis today, I'm identifying the share of women who are employed by the garment industry at the sub-district level using the economic census of Bangladesh. The census was conducted in 2013 itself, but before the minimum wage was increased. Then second, I am using information on hours worked by employees in the garment industry, as well as earnings of these workers using labor force surveys, and those are self-reported earning information. I'm using primarily 3 survey rounds, 2010, 2013, and 2015 to 16. And lastly, for today's discussion, I am looking at attitudes towards intimate partner violence, as well as women's contribution to decision-making, both with respect to themselves and other household-related decisions, using the demographic health survey. Since observations of the demographic health survey are representative at the national level, I am reweighting the observations of the survey data to make the estimates representative at the sub-district level. So just to begin with, I wanted to first, actually I'll go back this slide and then start talking about the data that I wanted to show today. I wanted to first go back and unpack what is happening in the garment sector and trying to get an understanding of the context of what the hours worked and earnings of workers look like in the garment industry. And so when I started plotting what the hours worked in the past week looked like for workers over time, what I see is that there is a bunching. This is the orange line, is the orange solid distribution is actually hours worked in the last week reported in the 2013 labor force survey prior to the minimum wage increase. And there was a bunching of workers working either less than the regular hours of 48 hours or below the maximum limit of 60 hours in the week. And this sort of becomes more concentrated around the 48-hour threshold in 2015. However, what I see over time, there is still quite a significant increase in the hours in the share of workforce that is working overtime. As you can see in 2016, there is a much bigger bulk of workers who are concentrated around this maximum 60-hour limit for working in the week. So I think it's generally, I would say, while there was sort of an improvement in 2013, but there has been a significantly an increase in the number of hours employees in the garment industry are working in the past week. And then when I'm looking at hourly earnings, actually, sorry, I will just take a moment to also talk about how this differs for women and men. So the solid lines for the distribution are basically the sample of employees that are women, and the dashed lines is depicting men. What I see is that over time, especially if you see from 2013 to 2016, the share of women that are working overtime is increasing, and it seems even though there was some sort of a uniformity in 2015 where the hours worked for men and women started looking very similar, but over time, as you see from 2013 moving on to 2016, the overtime by of female workers in the garment industry has been increasing. And then I'll now go on to talking about what hourly earnings look like. So the solid lines here are the reported cash earnings or reported hourly earnings for workers. And what I am estimating in the dashed lines are what are their hourly earnings, excluding their overtime pay. So as I mentioned, the regular hours in a week are 48, and so all hours worked by an employee after 48 is requires them to be paid a separate amount, which is their overtime. In literature, there is no standardization of how overtime is paid across firms in this industry. And from the literature, it's either that firms choose to pay 1.5 times the basic salary, or it could be twice. So keeping that in mind, I've run two estimations of what hourly pay looks like for workers, assuming it's either 1.5 times their basic salary or twice. And what I am seeing is that hourly earnings have been decreasing over time. So as you see from 2013 to now 2015 and 16, there is just the distribution has moved to the left. And so that's sort of concerning that over time, especially with the increase in minimum wage policy at the end of 2013, what workers are reporting is that there's been a reduction in their hourly earnings. So this is sort of counterintuitive to what I was expecting. And it also makes it sort of difficult to predict then how would this be affecting women's intra-household outcomes, and especially their experience of intimate partner violence. Just to specifically look at how our hourly earnings are changing for men and women separately. Here, what I'm plotting is their hourly earnings, excluding their overtime pay. And what I see is that again, there was a spike. It's interesting to see that there was a spike in how much women were earning in 2013. And this is again reported earnings before the minimum wage policy was increased at the end of 2013. And then however that effect has sort of tapered off. And for both men and women, there has been a decline in their earnings. And just to also kind of counter check, to go back and cross check that this isn't a trend in the economy in Bangladesh, and there wasn't something else that was going on. I did a robustness check, which is basically a synthetic difference in difference to look at the to compare hourly earnings of workers in the garment industry with workers outside the garment industry. And this is basically a comparison group that's artificially created that best reflects the trends in hourly earnings prior to the minimum wage increase in 2013. And I find that this decline in earnings is specific to the garment sector. So from between 2013 to 2015. And so this is something I'm still trying to unpack more as to what has happened across these years of years time period that has been affecting the hours worked and earnings of workers in the garment industry. But moving on to what I'm trying to study now is the just how attitudes have changed towards violence for women, and also their contribution and role in decision making within the household. So to study that, I create two variables. Both of them are in sort of an index. The first category is an index of IPV attitudes, and the second is of women's contribution to decision making. In the interest of time, I won't spend too much time. I will not go into a discussion of how this index is calculated, but I can go back to this if during Q&A if required. And one more thing I want to share before I talk about the empirical strategy is that there is a huge spatial variation in the share of women employed in a sub-district in the garment industry, and I'm plotting that here using information from the economic census on the left-hand side. And this variation in employment at the sub-district level does correspond very well with how these registered firms and how they're located across the country. While I also mentioned that the right-hand side the firm location is from 2022, so it's very recent. And it does still compare very well with past reported data of employment by the garment industry. And so I want to exploit this with spatial variation in the following way, where I want to capture how at the sub-district level, okay, I realize I'm out of time, but I'll just take a minute to talk about the strategy and what I have so far. So I'm analyzing the trend at the sub-district level, and what I'm trying to capture is how the IPV in this index or the index of decision making has changed or deviates from the average value in 2011 across time, and see its correspondence with the exposure of the sub-district to the garment industry. And I'm capturing this exposure by weighting them with the share of employment of women in the sub-district by the garment industry and multiplying it by the law of changes earnings of women at the division level across time. I am also controlling for risk factors that can affect attitudes towards violence and also women's contribution in decision making. These risk factors are coming from literature and are likely to affect women's role in decision making and also attitudes towards violence, and include both women's spousal characteristics as well as household and community characteristics. And other than just looking at the effect of changes in earnings for women, I also test for changes in relative earnings of women to men across time to understand if that's linked with how the outcome variable changes. What I am finding so far, and I want to just share very briefly, is some sort of a positive correspondence, which is not what I would have anticipated, but these results are not statistically significant. And I do lose a lot of observations at the sub-district level because the demographic health survey does not survey every sub-district. So I'm still trying to understand what is the best way to study this effect of exposure to the garment sector on my outcomes of interest. Where I'd like to conclude for today is the roadmap. I want to be able to test for this effect of exposure on the actual reported incidence of IPV, and for which I will be using violence against women surveys. This data set is not publicly available, and so I'm still in the process of data acquisition. And ultimately, what my broader research interest is to be able to unpack the effect of the minimum wage policy in these industries on both attitudes and incidence of intimate partner violence. So I would like to be able to study this question in multiple countries like Cambodia and Vietnam as well. And I'll stop here for today. Thank you so much for listening.
I'll be shorter so we can ask him more questions. I can give up 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Sorry, there's no question about the education strategy. I was saying that you were asking the wage change on the, no?
No, so
Long difference, is it essentially significant?
no, so this is not a difference in difference design. What I have just for now is testing this correlation between exposure to the garment sector at the sub-district level to my outcome variable. The causal effect I showed was just the trends in hourly earnings in the garment industry when compared with a synthetic comparison group. And that was just to look at summary statistics, but this equation here is not a causal estimation of employment or exposure to the garment industry on IPV. Yeah.
Well, also, I think you can probably look at the paper by Professor Sarah Tony at Rice University. I think she has a working paper that has a nice model of bargaining and violence. And I think in her model, she tried to model like how it affects domestic violence and essentially
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, Aditi, you had a question.
So, I have a question about, so you mentioned that it's unlikely that this minimum wage policy change is going to affect the human partner lives through anything else that's not income. But if women are working overtime, that means that they're staying outside of the house more. So I'm just asking.
Right,
how do you
right.
look at the exposure theory aspect of this, and is that something that you plan to explore?
Right, so that would be one hypothesis, that if women are spending more time outside home, then they are likely to have lesser exposure to violence. And however, from just field anecdotes, I would say that also increases the susceptibility to violence as they're away from home and household responsibilities. So I do not have a hypothesis for this analysis, but it is a question I'm looking at and I'm hoping to get more insights into. But my understanding, and that's why I spent so much time today talking about how hours worked are changing and hourly earnings are changing, is to be able to really get to the understanding of how the minimum wage policy is affecting the economic outcomes of workers, and if that differs across men and women, and then looking at women's outcomes within home. So yeah, it's still a work in progress. Thank you for that.
So there's a percentage breakdown of the paper. Where they're looking at kind of like which kind of IPV theories actually have any teeth, and exposure is actually not confident with the rest of the time greater. Like earnings, exposure is not really that helpful.
Okay. All right. Okay, that is, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Oh, did you have another question?
Other questions on
Okay, let me just. I'm able to maximize Zoom. Meeting control. Okay, so no, there aren't any. All right. So I think I will give the floor to Nick now. Thank you.
We have 13 minutes.
Oh, okay.
I'll give you 20 more seconds.
All right, so I am Nick Magnan at the University of Georgia, and this is joint work with Thomas Safo, is a recent graduate now going to Tufts. Oh, okay. And Ellen McCullough and Tammy McGavick at Grinnell College. And I mean, I can sum up the motivation for this with a quote that one of the women we were interviewing said about collecting firewood and how her husband would do it, but because he doesn't have a donkey, it's the wife's job. And there's a lot of these gendered tasks, you know, throughout the developing world, and I'm sure everybody who's in this session is familiar with this. And it's often very time-consuming, arduous work. And one reason why these norms are so strong, and also so problematic in developing countries, is because there's like a limited scope for technology to replace labor. For instance, people don't have washing machines. So, you know, study after study show that women do a lot more total work than men. These are stats from the WHO. That show that women do more work overall, 500 minutes per day compared to about 450 per man. But the difference is really due to that unpaid work, that women's work. And this can be, you know, inefficient because you have a misallocation of talent, and you have women not getting as educated as they might be because they have to do a lot of tasks. And so it's a big concern. I mean, besides the obvious, you know, problems of women being, you know, having to do all of this work. So while these attitudes are strong, There's a lot of research that shows that they are malleable, either through technological change, the expansion of the media, family composition, and also policies and programs that are specifically targeted to change gender norms. So we're focusing on the role of misperceptions in gender norms. So consider an equilibrium where men generally, personally, privately, are okay with doing what's societally considered women's work, right? But they believe that other men do not accept this. So even though they're personally okay doing the women's work, they're not going to do it, because if other men see them do it or hear they're doing it, they're going to experience social sanctions. And so these misperceptions keep men from doing chores that they are actually okay doing. And this phenomenon actually dates back nearly a century. It's been called the illusion of universality, where everybody thinks that everybody thinks something, even though that feeling is not universal at all, and also pluralistic ignorance. And so this is a Pareto inefficient allocation of time, skills, and energy. So the idea here is to use an intervention to correct these misperceptions and move families into a more efficient and equitable allocation of household labor. And the kind of the motivation and the field experiment we're using are adopted from a study by Bergsten and al. In Saudi Arabia, where they look at men's personal feelings about their wives engaging in paid labor. And they find that men are personally okay with the wives engaging in paid labor, but they think that other men are not okay with this. And as a result, they are not permissive of their wives seeking paid labor. All right, so what we're going to try to learn is, do men actually hold these strong beliefs about the acceptability of men doing women's work? And we find that not everybody believes that. We are going to look at whether men misperceive others' beliefs about the acceptability of men doing women's work, and we find that they do misperceive others' beliefs. And finally, we're going to see if correcting these misperceptions through an intervention can lead to greater participation of men in these women's jobs. So this experiment is happening with poor rural households in northern Ethiopia. And it's part of a larger project where we're working with CARE and World Vision in these livelihood programs. So these men and these women are not like a totally random sample of rural Ethiopian households. They're already engaged in these programs. So that was the sample we had to work with, right? And they are organized in these communities called VESAs. So after the first day that we enter the VESA, we take a baseline survey. And on the third day, we implement the gender norms activity. And here is how the gender norms activity works. You get together the group of all the men in this VESA, and you bring them for this session. And they're used to gathering for events as part of being in this program. And they each receive a bag, and the bag is a piece of paper with a bunch of figures in it, and it has some black chips and some white chips. So they're asked a bunch of questions. The first question, do you think it is acceptable for a man to collect firewood? And they put a black chip in the bag privately if they think it's acceptable, and a white chip if they don't. So putting the chip in the bag. So now we ask them, how many men do you think answered yes to this question? And using that piece of paper, they are going to circle how many men they think in the group answered yes to the question, including themselves if they did, and excluding themselves if they didn't. So the three questions we asked are, do you think it's okay or acceptable for men to collect firewood, care for a child, and do his own laundry? So we had a list of many, many tasks, and we pre-tested and asked around, and these seem to be the three with kind of both a strong gender norm and the possibility of change. For instance, Thomas, so I think, yeah, he's on Zoom. You know, he said there's no way that you're going to get men to prepare a chair out. Just not possible, right? So there's no reason to put that down. So we picked one that that men seemed, you know, possibly open to changing. And we also asked some placebo questions, just to kind of hide the ball a little bit about what we were doing about nutrition. All right, so now comes the treatment. We have everybody's personal attitudes. We have their perceptions of the other attitudes. So the treatment is the truth. Right. So what we do is we divide the people at these meetings into two groups. One group goes to one enumerator to talk about health and other community stuff, just to kind of occupy them, while the others get the truth. And the truth is demonstrated to them like this, like, okay, there were 8 of you at this meeting, and 7 of you said it was acceptable for men to collect fire. So here is the treatment group getting the truth. All right. So at the end of this session, in both the treatment and the control group, we asked people if you will do this task this week, right? And so the idea is we're going to collect data right away to see if it changed people's intention. So it's not a great outcome, but it is an outcome we wanted to have. All right. And then a week later, we collected data not from the men, but from the wives to ask, hey, did anyone in the house collect wood yesterday? If so, so it wasn't asking like, did your husband do this? Did your husband do that? It wasn't like that direct. We just asked who did it, and then we coded as husband did it or husband didn't do it. So that's how we got the actual data on whether or not the men did the work. I spent a lot of time making tables to update the results, and these aren't done, but that's okay. I can explain the results. All right. So this graph shows just the level of acceptability. So personal acceptability is the blue. The guess of others' acceptability is the green. So you can see that men were generally very personally accepting of this, and on average, they were pretty close to guessing right, but they were a little bit short. So there was some misperception. People do think it was less socially acceptable than it actually is. Now, at the same time, you see very little performance of these tasks, right? So if they say it's acceptable, they pretty much think other people think it's acceptable, but there's very little doing of the tasks. All right. So the average is pretty close, but the average can be kind of deceptive. Like there's a bunch of under perceiving and a little bit of over perceiving. So what we're going to do is we are going to look at treatment effects on, first of all, whether or not people said they were going to do the thing. And we look at whether they're going to do any tasks, and then whether they do a specific task. And there was a big increase in people saying that they were going to do any task, and it was all driven by the collection of firewood. So men got corrected on how acceptable it is to collect firewood. There was the biggest gap there. And then they were more likely to say that they were going to get firewood. So did they actually do it? Well, we collected data in 2 different ways from the women. There was one group of the women that were asked in person whether who did the task, and then there was another group that was asked over the phone. So they were called every day for that week, And then, so we had a lot more data from that group. And from the group that was asked over the phone, we did find a similar increase in the collection of fireworks. So the women said the men were, it turns out, I mean, it was like a 5 percentage point increase, but that works out to be over double, right? So it was pretty impactful on collecting the firewood. With the in-person data, we didn't see that same increase in the collection of firewood, but we did see a strong increase in childcare. And we're still trying to reconcile one method of data collection gave one result and the other method gave a different one. But both ways it was effective in increasing men's participation. So the Bernstein paper hypothesizes that the change in behavior is going to be driven by the people who have their misperceptions corrected. So like the men that are over here, it's going to be super impactful for them. And for the men over here, it's not going to be impactful. So we could test that dimension of heterogeneity, and we don't find a strong difference. We find that it was, a little stronger for the people that underperceived, but not that much stronger. And one reason why that might be is that while it doesn't shift the mean of the distribution of how acceptable people think a task is, it narrows it, right? And I had a really nice figure that I made to show you guys this, but you'll have to imagine. But what it does is it narrows the distribution. So you have many less men that think, for instance, like less than half of men think it's acceptable. So you take these men out of this like fear of social sanction zone just to show them like, yeah, like other people do think it is acceptable. Like you think they think it's acceptable, but you're not sure, and then you get confirmation, it narrows the distribution, right? So yeah, thanks, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
I'm just wondering how do we define childcare? Because there are probably only so many ways you can collect firewood and you want it, but I just assume that because the portion of man that it's a form of childcare baseline is much higher than that too. So there are different ways of defining what childcare is depending on the person.
Yeah, I don't know, Thomas, if you want to chime in on that and how exactly that question was asked, because you were there, feel free.
So if I heard the question correctly, how is childcare defined?
Yeah, how is childcare defined?
Yeah, so there are different activities of caring for a child. So for example, bathing your child, feeding your child, and calming your child. So when we mention childcare, we mention examples of different activities of childcare.
So these are all active things, like doing something for the child, not just like supervising the child while she plays.
Yeah, but we also emphasized just holding a child for a small number of minutes does not mean that the men were caring for child. That can happen every time. But when we say child care, we wanted more than just holding a child for few minutes. I mean, few number of minutes by men. So we were explaining when we say child care by men, we were explaining like if you are bathing your child, if you are feeding your child, if you are holding your child for a longer time or just for a few minutes, that is how we were explaining, defining child care.
Thanks. So yeah, it was a bunch of questions, and if they answered in the affirmative to any of them, then they were coded as a 1. Yeah, Travis.
So two things. I mean, it does seem like we would expect bigger gaps, and it sounds almost like you expected to see bigger gaps. But I'm thinking, so two explanations that come to mind, and I'm just curious your reaction. One is that maybe this is an area where they have received a lot of interventions, or you mentioned something about, as part of a care project or something. So one, that question, that's one about like external mobility, like if we went to totally different communities, maybe you would see bigger gap. The other one is like, and I guess Thomas's reaction kind of suggests this, that maybe it's more of like an extensive and intensive margin thing where it's like, yeah, I think it's acceptable for me to cut firewood. But if you ask the question, is it acceptable for me to spend 3 hours a day cutting firewood? No way. Right? I mean, maybe it's about like not the idea of doing the chore, but maybe there's like a threshold of doing it for more than 3 or 4 hours a day. Or something. I don't know. Thoughts?
I mean, on the first thing, yeah, that's always been a big concern is that this group of people is kind of pre-crime world vision and care. We're paying for us to do this stuff with their participants. So, yeah, I would like to try it somewhere else. Yeah, I mean, the extensive versus intensive margin, I mean, I guess we were thinking more like the acceptability would be like, not like collecting 4 hours of firewood, like I don't want to do that, it's acceptable, it's hard work, but we were really thinking about the social sanctions. So whether your buddies see you collecting firewood for 5 minutes or 4 hours, like they see you collecting firewood and they're gonna make fun of you.
Yes.
So that was kind of our expectation there. Background?
I've kind of two related questions. So one was, so you know, what we see here is that the percent accepted, seems to be larger, and so I'm just wondering if men are kind of like, the self-report is like, oh, I think this is acceptable, but the community, the other men don't, so that's how I justified it not being, you know, like, not actually doing it.
Yeah.
So you're necessarily actually doing it, like, do you see any of that?
Well, I mean, if I understand correctly, that's what we like really think is going on. And that's the misperception we're trying to correct, right? Is people saying they think it's acceptable and then seeing other people, but thinking other people don't.
But it's not, so what I'm getting is like not a misperception, but it's like, I'm gonna tell you that I accept it.
Right.
And that others don't, and that's how I justify me in reality not having not doing it myself.
Okay.
So just like, kind of like, telling you what you wanna hear.
That's kind of complex, right? Because do
But
you
this is like
think everybody else is doing the same thing?
The difference is that, right, like, so everybody's doing something, everybody's it's like everybody else thinks that men shouldn't do this.
Yeah.
But I think I should, because everybody else thinks that I shouldn't, then that's why I do it. So I tell you what you want to hear, and then justify that I by telling you that, but because it is not socially acceptable.
Well, I mean, that's kind of interesting because then maybe you could have a situation where people don't think it's personally acceptable, but they all lie. And then they see the lies of their comrades. And if they believe the lies, then they might think it's socially acceptable, whereas in reality it's not. So yeah,
I'm getting a little bit like the next questions are really like kind of like the next stuff like that. So and this relates to my second question, and I know that too much time. But how are you using your placebo? Were the placebo questions asked in the same way? Like is it acceptable to you? Is it acceptable to others?
Mhm.
You use those as like your control group?
no, so we didn't use that for the control group. We just asked everybody that. We didn't do the same, like here's a truth about eating eggs. We didn't do that. We did something else to occupy the control group this time. But we asked questions that alternated between like the chores and then like eggs are important or going, school is important, just so it wouldn't be like so obvious that this was all about gender, like let's eat chores to everybody, like because we wanted to kind of throw the control group off the center.
And I have to
And then, yes. Yes.
Quick question in terms of, are you guys going back in the future, follow up to see if are these actions still happening, or is this a short-term response to the training, just curious about the longevity factor?
Yeah, I mean, that's always important, like asking after a week, but it was a pretty short, like time limit with each of the groups. Yeah, so we're not going to go back in a year to see if it changed. And if CARE or World Vision wanted to do it, I mean, it probably wouldn't be that hard to like call the wives again. They're picking up the phone and they're used to doing it, so it might not be that expensive. Well, maybe we should do that. That'd be great. And so the Bertson paper, they do that. They go back after quite a bit of time and look at the actions of the men, whether the women applied for a job, whether they were working, and and found long-term effects of this seemingly pretty minor intervention. The misperceptions in the first paper, like they were much stronger, much stronger. All right, so I'm out of time, and I'm out of time. I got to run after this, but please find me and follow up with any questions in the PD.
Did I continue more about the same project? Different paper. Okay, so I'm Aditi Kadam. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Georgia. I also work with Nick, I work with Ellen, my fellow and from there. But I'll be presenting my paper on trying to measure social norms and social beliefs better. And just to give you a background, this paper is also, like I mentioned, from the bigger RCT that Nick just mentioned. We have like 6 or 7 papers coming out of it, but I came in my first year and the plan was already on, and I'm like, can I just ask these 2 questions and get a paper? And it worked out, so we're here now. So I'll try to keep it really short. Thanks for still being here. I'll tell you why I think this is important, and I'll tell you what I do, and then hopefully convince you what I do is good. So just a preview, we are trying to estimate the causal effects. It's a measurement experiment. So we're trying to randomize different types of different methods of asking these questions and then seeing how do these different types survey methods affect the respondents or the reporting of social beliefs and social norms. So what are the 3 treatments? We randomize whether these questions are asked over the phone, whether they are asked by a male or a female enumerator, and lastly, we have, like, as a part of the bigger RCT, we are making these frequent, high-frequency communications with the respondents, and we're going to see if communicating with them frequently has any effect on how they report. And initial findings show that mobile phones or asking questions using a mobile phone does not have any different reporting than it would in a face-to-face interview. Now, there's always a question about, these are like sensitive questions. We're asking them about their beliefs on domestic violence and their emotional well-being. So maybe there's this debate that we don't know what the truth is. Maybe, both face-to-face traditional as well as phone interviews are getting us the wrong estimate, but if they're wrong, they're just as wrong. So why are we spending just all this extra money to go into the field and ask them it using a traditional face-to-face interview? And we also find that communicating more frequently with the survey team and with the enumerators, women tend to report that they have a higher independence to move around outside of the house. So what got me really excited about this was that sensitive questions are very tricky to study. Like, we don't know what the truth is, and doing a random stranger going into a household and asking a woman about, hey, what do you think about a husband beating his wife? That's kind of a very difficult situation to be in, right? Like, the woman might have internalized social norms. She might be scared of telling you the answer, and she might be scared of accepting that she's going through all these experiences. So measuring that traditionally using face-to-face interviews, I honestly don't think that's a great idea at all. So I was like, can we try to get to something different? Can we see if we can be better about asking these questions if we want to get better data? And all of these reasons ultimately end up leading to misreporting, and that causes it makes it a lot harder to estimate treatment effects if we are looking at these outcome variables. And the most difficult part is we know that these misreporting errors exist, but we don't know what the direction of the bias is. So what I'm trying to do is, we know it's wrong, but can we at least find out whether we're getting an overestimated number or an underestimated number? What's causing these biases? Because if we can understand that, then I think even if we're off by the truth, we'll know how much we are off and in which direction we're off. So like I mentioned, there's a lot of reasons. There's incentives to over-report as well as under-report social beliefs and your freedom of independence and emotional well-being. So you might see women over-reporting data because of internalized social norms. So for example, I come from a decently patriarchal culture, and my mom always told me, don't go out of the house after 7 p.m. So her telling me this constantly makes me believe that if I go out of the house after 7 p.m., then I'm not a good daughter, I'm not a good wife, I'm not a good mom. So then that behavior of not going out of the house is kind of the desirable behavior. I want to be a good daughter, a good wife, and a good mother. So I'd say that it's good to not go out of the house, and that's why you would see that women might over-report certain outcomes. Then there's the social desirability bias that was mentioned earlier in this presentation, where respondents might want to kind of give enumerators the answers that they want to hear. There's some literature on, like, for example, like if a female respondent is answering to a female enumerator, then there's like a higher likelihood that, okay, you know what, you're my peer, so I want to make sure that you don't think of me any lower, so I'm going to tell you what's going on here, and yeah, like go female empowerment. So these are the reasons for over-reporting it, and on the other side, there's reasons for under-reporting, which I mentioned earlier, like women might feel embarrassed. These topics have a taboo associated, and speaking about it loud is risky, right? Like it's a household interview in rural areas. Like someone might hear me saying that my husband beat me, which might lead to more beatings. So I might not want to report it in the first place. So to kind of understand like what are these desirability and other biases going on, we're trying to create a framework. This is still work in progress, so any feedback would be really appreciated. But for now, we're looking at two aspects. One is trait desirability, so that's kind of going back to like the desirability of a behavior. It depends on the social context and the social norms of the region you're talking about. So it's very important to understand what is considered desirable in the area that you're studying. You can't just take the same question, ask it in the same way in another region and expect to find the same answers, because that would be important. It is also about, so there's also need for social approval, which is more to do about who is asking the question. So it's more about the enumerator, it's more about if it's a male or a female, if it's on the phone or not. And how can I best make the person in front of me happier? So that's the second. These are like the two aspects that we're looking at about misreporting. So in our intervention, like I mentioned, it's just a simple measurement intervention. So we randomize whether the respondents are getting these questions on the mobile phone or they're getting it in a traditional face-to-face interview. We randomize conditional on being asked on the phone. We test whether a female enumerator asking the questions or a male enumerator asking the question has any effects on reporting. And lastly, we leverage this high frequency data collection. So just to give you an idea of what that high frequency looks like, we have like weeks, we have like 7 days where female enumerators are calling the respondents like 5 times a week, 5 times a day, asking them, hey, what are you doing right now? So I'm assuming that this is kind of like, you know, it's very personal, right? You call me at any time and you're asking me what I'm doing, I'm telling you this. So I kind of trust you in a way over this period of seven days. So we're gonna see if this constant communication has any effect on how you report social beliefs and your experiences. I'm gonna skip through this because Nick went over it a little bit, but we have these VESAs and we select one woman from every household who is either the head of the household or the spouse of the head of the household, and we have a final sample of 646 women. To tell you like what these questions look like, so we're like trying to capture these 3 big domains of women's lives. First is their perceptions about physical safety and physical violence. Second is their own experiences of emotional and physiological, and physiological well-being. And lastly, their experiences of independence of mobility. So the physical safety index, we have like the traditional like DHS type violence towards, index of attitudes towards violence. And so the second question is really interesting because it helps us like get an idea of what context are we in. So in the data that I have, over 95% of women say that it is the woman's role in a household to tolerate violence to keep their family together. So we're talking about very rural areas with fairly strong patriarchal norms. Then the emotional and physiological well-being indicators are about like how does the relationship of the wife and the husband look like? Is it mutually respectable? Do they trust each other? And the last question here is interesting because we also find that majority of the women are at least sometimes afraid of their partner. And that again tells us that we're in a very patriarchal type of a setup. And then lastly, we have the freedom of movement, which is about whether the women are allowed to go, or whether the women can go out of the house without any objections from other family members. The strategy is pretty simple. We just, since all the treatments are randomized, we just create dummies for whether the respondent is getting asked the questions by a male or female on the phone, or so the control group here is the traditional face-to-face interviews by males. I want to point out that our like face-to-face interviews are just male enumerators, which like we know from talking in our pilot surveys that tends to be the norm in this area that we're working in. It's kind of unsafe for female enumerators to go out. So we have a traditional face-to-face male interview, then we have phone male, phone female, and the PX group is the high frequency group. So we're interested in, these are like our three main hypotheses. For a male enumerator, is there any difference in reporting when asked in person versus when asked over the phone? For a phone, conditional on having received a phone survey, does it matter whether a male is asking it or a female is asking it? And lastly, do you see any effects of having these constant communications on the reporting? So so the report effect, we just have conditional on being asked by a phone female. That's because we don't have like another group, so we cannot test it to the full sample, and the timing of the phone male interviews was not aligning exactly with the phone female, so we can't use the phone group, but we can use the phone female group. So these are results. Hopefully maybe I can convince that the non-results are null, but we do find that the phone, asking over the phone does not really have any statistically significant effect. The magnitudes are, I would say, relatively small, but yeah, we don't. So it's basically, we're going to say that there is no effect of using a phone. So you would get just the same answers as you would in a traditional face-to-face interview. Then we find that if a female enumerator is asking these questions on the phone, women tend to say that they have lower freedom of movement. So these indices go in a way that if it's a higher number, then the woman is kind of more empowered, and a lower number is less empowered. So freedom of movement, a negative coefficient would mean that women are reporting a lower freedom of movement when asked by the female enumerators. And getting to know the enumerators and the survey team more results in reporting a higher level of independence to move around. So this is kind of just to show a little bit more about what's driving these phone effects to be null. So we find that these estimates are pretty much all over the place, except for maybe literally just one of the outcomes that goes into these index seems significant, but otherwise it seems like they're just like all over the place. So they're fairly close to zero, with some noise here and there. And just to reiterate the results that I said, we find that if a phone does not really change reporting, we find that women enumerators tend to get answers that report lower freedom of movement. There's this debate again, is that closer to the truth? Are women answering more? So like, for example, like it goes back to the internalizing the social norms. If a man is asking me, are you allowed to go home, or allowed to leave the house? Then I would probably be like, no, I'm not allowed to leave the house. But if a female is asking it, then the woman would be like, okay, I trust you, and you probably leave the house, so I'm gonna tell you that I also leave the house. And then the last hypothesis, we find that building a rapport with the female enumerators leads to a higher reporting of independence and movement. So what that one of the explanations, like going back to the trait desirability and for social approval, could be that, you know, when you start to know a person better, you want to gain their respect more, and you kind of want them to see you in this more positive light. So that could be one of the reasons that's causing women to report a higher freedom of movement to someone whom they've like been or to like a team of 3 people who they've been interacting with for a long period of time. Like I said, this is still work in progress, and we're still to develop a proper framework to get closer to the directionalities of these biases. But just conclusion and where we can go from here, we find that phone interviews are just as well, or I should probably make that just as bad as face-to-face interviews. That could be a place for potential cost reductions. And rapport leads to a higher reporting of mobility and maybe even respondents accessing mobility to other human enumerators. And with that, I think that, yeah, that's it.
How likely do you think it is that when you're calling a woman on the phone, someone else is in the house and potentially listening?
So actually that was like when we were just piloting this, if we came up with like their favorite paper on like women, people are using speaker phones to answer questions. So we immediately went back and were like, no, we gotta make sure that speaker phones are not being used and women are alone. So we're making sure before asking the questions that women are alone, except for the presence of, I think, less than a 5-year-old child. But yeah, we do ask them and ensure that they're alone.
I wanted to ask you, how did you test for the level with the numerator? We have a specific checkpoint.
So just in our sample, we have like a certain, like a subsample receives these high frequency phone calls, and the other subsample does not receive the high frequency phone calls, and then we just test the difference in the 2 groups.
Okay, so by design,
Correct.
more frequent interaction is likely.
That is
better. Okay.
Yeah.
And it also, I mean, you told me that it's really hard to collect this data, but do you think it's even possible to really get to this result that you want without any qualitative interviews? Or this is a question that you can answer just based on quantitative intervention?
I don't know if I have an answer.
I mean, I find this super interesting.
Yeah.
Like as said, I mean, it's really important to know.
Right.
Where the bias, if there's bias in my direction.
So, yeah, I think that's kind of the goal, right? Want to get to the truth, and I think creating a framework for trying to understand the different types of biases and what cause those biases is a step in the right direction. And hopefully someday we can get to the truth, but yeah. Sorry, I'm sure I'm more optimistic. Yeah, I agree. Let's see if we have any questions online. I'm using too much Teams now. Yeah.
I think it would be good to put your, I don't know if you're doing it in the paper, so just, yeah, I haven't seen the paper, but I would put in that your work in the context of your systems as well, right? Thinking of especially in IBD. 2, you use in the presentation, maybe for the system, but use examples on incidents, but even when you're not looking at certain for attitudes, when you were presenting these examples. And VHS in the women's module does not use melody breakers, right? It's always within breakers in all the countries in which they work, including Ethiopia. So for the other indicators, it's relevant, like for instance, like the with the male person,
yeah, about the list, I had a slide about like what are the current different types of methods and how are we improvising on those, but I took it off for the lack of time. But yeah, list experiments, I guess, like the biggest critique for that is that it's noisy and you need a very large sample. And you can't, it's very difficult to do any micro level analyses, like, because you get answers, you get something, but that's like district level or at a much larger level than at the micro level. That's how we say that we're trying to do it differently, maybe, and list experiments. Originally, my idea had started with list experiments, I think the first meeting we had, because list experiments, and then we realized that maybe that might not get us what we are looking for. But, and about taking point about the DHS and the attitudes, I eventually want to connect this paper to the DHS because the DHS does, so the attitudes towards violence are the only common questions in the DHS that I've found, but at least that's, I'm working on it right now to connecting it to DHS. I think we can end it there. Oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead. So no, actually I never even got to go because of COVID and the Civil War. Like I started my first year and I was too busy with freelance, so I couldn't go. And then we got hit with COVID and then now the Civil War. So as of now, I don't see us going back. Same answer as like we would like to, maybe if CARE gives us more funding.
It's quite possible.
Yeah, that's good to know.
I was getting money from CARE.
I wonder if she's good. I know she's on vacation. All right. Thanks for coming, everyone, and sticking around. I really appreciate it.